After 6 months of backpacking across Europe and Turkey, I entered northern Iraq. Driving west along the contested border, we passed empty rolling desert, darkened by barbed wire and military bases, silent apart from their eerie fluttering flags. Despite the clear and constant reminders of recent war, I was quickly overwhelmed by the warmth of the Arab world. Walking through Baghdad, I was welcomed and waved to everywhere I went. Rarely paying for my food or transport, the inhabitants of the battered city showed me a generosity and kindness that left me speechless. A loving community full of shisha, chai and dominoes blossoms there, in the face of generational trauma and a political system yet to recover. After a month in the capital, I joined 20 million Shia Muslims for their annual pilgrimage to the magnificent shrines of Karbala. Showered in never-ending free food and drinks along the way, we slept through the 40-plus degrees daytime heat in huge tents overflowing with other pilgrims. Once we were dressed for the occasion, we were swept to and through a colossal shrine, spilling cool-conditioned air into the surrounding crowds and boasting more wealth than the entire Iraqi federal government. We just about managed to touch the tomb of Imam Hussein, buried deep inside. Sleeping on a roof of a bombed-out building and held for hours in an army base, my exit from the country was grueling, but eventually ended with an unforgettable army escort to the Jordan border, with machine guns moved off seats to make space in the bullet-ridden armoured trucks. After a brief but beautiful adventure to the Dead Sea and a failed attempt at sneaking into Petra, I said goodbye to some wonderful friends and made my way to Israel. The police weren't too happy about my Iraq stamps, but eventually let me through, and I had a bit of an awe-inspired wake-up call to find myself face-to-face with the ancient infamous walls of Jerusalem. An epicentre of spirituality and devastating conflict, the patchwork layers of culture and religion, sacred monuments and eternal tensions that make up this city are truly beyond description. I was fascinated by my brief encounter with Orthodox Judaism and intend to one day learn more, but the seething demon of the Palestine conflict left me unsettled and achy. I soon left the city behind, walked to Bethlehem and hitchhiked across the humble, resilient and yet somehow joyful West Bank. Alternating between drivers from both sides, I was gifted with a view of the conflict that left me even more stricken and heartbroken by the time I reached the Egyptian border. Blasting around the Sinai Peninsula under a blanket of stars and through red-tinted desert, I eventually made it to Cairo and the Great Pyramids of Giza. A sharp U-turn left me hitchhiking back east and eventually onto a boat to Saudi. I was instantly amazed by the humility and lightness of the Saudi people. It is genuinely the country where I felt the safest. I hitchhiked with ease across the peaceful endless desert, stopping in the holy but joltingly modern city of Medina to stay with a wonderful young family in their huge ancestral home. Blessed by their welcome, the highlight was nonetheless the opportunity to spend time with the intelligent, tenacious and fiery women of the family, quickly laying to rest my prejudice. A brief adventure hunting down a mysterious rock deep in the desert and a hasty 5-kilometre moonlit hike back to the road left me with a deeper appreciation for the treacherous landscape that has cultivated their humble and hospitable culture. Reinforced by a slight scare caught out in the open for a night-long sandstorm, I eventually arrived in Dubai, where I began to hunt for a boat across the Gulf. Unsuccessful, I continued on to Oman, where without fail I waited for less than a minute every single lift. Again staggered by their generosity, I ended up being invited for a delicious, authentic meal with the staff of a shipping company I had cold called. They pulled every string to try and get me on a boat, but we ran into the same legal problems as Dubai, so I ended up having to fly the few hundred kilometres to Karachi. Pakistan was the toughest challenge yet. I felt no threat of aggression, but I was often the first and likely the last foreigner they will ever see. People would stare and sometimes swarm, asking for selfies and handshakes, which was flattering, but there were often simply too many of them. I had the new challenge of sometimes having to be cold to nice people, for the simple sake of progress along the devastated and donkey-laden roads. Crippled by flooding, the concrete shells of rural southern towns were nothing less than post-apocalyptic. I've never encountered such poverty. Nonetheless, the people fight through, with a culture full of sugarcane and cricket, infatuated with idealised dreams of the Western world and a firm foundation of Islamic hospitality. The northern province of Punjab was a whole different world, more colourful, wealthy and seemingly stable, with the capital Islamabad a particularly beautiful, green and peaceful city, buried in the Himalayan foothills and scarred only by thick winter smog. Making friends with some Europeans in camper vans, we convoyed to Lahore once our India visas came through, where the already opaque smog somehow got thicker. Just about making it to the border as the closing ceremony started, we barely managed to slide through and were welcomed by an entire crowd of cheering and flag-waving Indians. Exploring the world-famous Golden Temple of Amritsar and sleeping out in rural farmlands, I regretfully parted ways with my new friends once we got to Delhi. This city buzzed. I did not expect to, but greatly enjoyed my stay there, exploring the narrow labyrinth of roads drenched in colours, textures and smells, as complex and diverse as the flavours of the roadside food stalls. Gourmet-level quality vegetarian food, leagues ahead of our own and for 20 pence a plate. India is a continent. Hitchhiking over 3,000 kilometres the entire length of the western coastline, I can safely say I have not even begun to scratch the surface. Language, foods and gods do a cultural backflip from one village to the next. Every nook and cranny is overflowing with life. A wrestling match between man and nature. All our imaginable force, and yet nature barely seems to notice, thriving in impossible gaps. It has been an overwhelming joy to explore a literal human and historical jungle. I found somewhat of a finish line for the journey in the glorious beaches and vibrant communities of Goa. One last hitchhike burst got me to the southernmost state of Kerala, where I met the hugging Hindu guru Amma, and from where I've booked my flight home. I sort of expected to get the travel bug out of my system, to whistle-stop tour the whole world then call it quits. Instead, I found myself all the more hungry to soak up whatever shreds of this beautiful planet I can. I think in the future I'll spend more time diving deeper into the places and communities I fall in love with, although saying goodbye to homes has always been the hardest part. I'd also love to travel with a smaller pack, perhaps just washing clothes more often and sticking to summer climates. But one thing's for sure, I will always travel by hitchhike. It's such a joy to never quite know where you're going.